Welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about inequality and poverty around the world. And it's important to first note that there are different types of inequality that we could talk about. We're going to focus mostly on economic inequality because it sort of bleeds over into every aspect of life. So, economic inequality can amplify some of the other types of inequality that we might look at. But some of those other types of inequality we could discuss is gender inequality, of course, which still is a problem in many countries around the world. Political inequality in countries where the public doesn't have a voice or the citizens don't have a voice in their own governance. Educational inequality, which sadly is a problem in many countries around the globe. Health inequality, which is a problem even in a very developed, um, wealthy economy like the United States. So, all of these types of inequality are important and really deserve some focus. But in this presentation, we're really just going to be focused mostly on economic inequality because, as I mentioned, they all kind of fit hand to hand. So, what is economic inequality? It's defined as unequal income and opportunity distribution. So, we could look at this as a measurement of income for the typical person, and then a measurement of wealth, sort of an accumulation of assets and money, of course. And what we see around the world is that there's a growing inequality that exists between the average person and the ultra rich, or what we might call the top 1%. We could really look at even the top 5% and see this massive gap between incomes and wealth accumulation. So those are some of the items we'll look at here in this presentation as we move along. So it's important to note when we talk about inequality and we talk about poverty, we're talking about two different things. So poverty is measured in a few different ways according to the World Bank. They have three different standards. One is at the bottom is extreme or absolute poverty, and this would be categorized as anyone living on less than $2.15 per day. So if you are living on that amount, that's your income on a daily average, then you are thought to be in this category of extreme or absolute poverty. Just above that would be moderate poverty, and this is anyone living on between 215 and 550 per day. These are all U.S. dollar terms, by the way. So here's where we find in the moderate poverty category. This is where we see about 25% of the world's population. Estimates were about 26%. About 2 billion people live in this moderate poverty range. Whereas extreme poverty, as of 2019, I think about 650 million or so people lived in extreme poverty. So moderate poverty is a larger category. It more people fall into that moderate poverty range. And then finally, the last category, according to the World Bank, is relative poverty. And this is basically household income below a proportion of the national average. So this is when there's a group of people who, though on a global scale might not be considered impoverished, within their own nation are considered impoverished when compared to the average income within that nation. So, for example, in the United States, the U.S. federal poverty line for a family of four is considered $31,200. This was 2024, so depending on when you listen to this, those numbers might be slightly outdated, especially with inflation. It could be that that number is even lower. But yes, but for the U.S., $31,200 is considered the poverty line. Anything below that is poverty. That seems crazy, probably in countries where there's a large percentage of the population that falls into extreme or absolute poverty. Because $31,200 might seem like a lot of money to some people. But in the United States, where the cost of living is quite high and where the average family brings in significantly more than 31,000 each year, then this becomes the relative poverty line. It means that people that make less than this are living at a substantially lower sort of quality of life than people that are making the average or typical income in that country. So these are three distinctions, right? You have extreme poverty, moderate poverty, relative poverty. Um, Inequality is a little bit of a different way of marking these things. So in a country like the U.S., where we don't have a lot of extreme poverty, but we do have a really high percentage of inequality, and that means that there's a there's a massive gap between what people are making at the bottom end of our of the wealth spectrum and the top end. We have some of the richest people in the world living in the United States. They're U.S. citizens. And we also have a large percentage of people making below what would be considered the poverty line. So that gap is what we look at and what we are talking about when we talk about inequality. So, what is inequality? Simple definition: it's a disproportionate distribution of resources, opportunities, and power among people worldwide. Um, we're primarily looking at resources or economics, but the truth is that, as we all know, when you are poor, you also miss out on opportunities. And when you're poor, you don't have power or influence in society the way that someone who's quite wealthy might have. So all of these are interlinked. They can't really be separated apart from one another. There are different measurement tools that we could use to measure inequality. There's something called the GI/NI index. Um, and it basically is just looking at income inequality or wealth inequality, and it's on a scale that attaches a numerical uh, score essentially for different nations based on income inequality. At the bottom end of the score or the scale, you would have perfect inequality, which means, or perfect equality, I should say, which means that everyone essentially has the same level of opportunity and income and access to resources and so on. Whereas the higher number would mean more inequality, means that there's a great disparity between what the typical person has access to versus the wealthiest in that society. So that's one tool that's used. You also have the Human Development Index, or HDI. It measures sort of the three basic dimensions of human development. It looks at longevity, or long and healthy lifespan, access to information and education, and then a standard of living score. And so these three dimensions are sort of surveyed and then used to create an HDI score or index that then people can look at to compare different countries and sort of how human development is proceeding in that country. And then there's also something called the Global Happiness Score, or Global Happiness Index. Sometimes you might see this referred to as the World Happiness Report. It gets reported in the news at times, but basically this is just a measure of subjective well-being, how good you feel about your life. And so they look at 6 different factors, and they ask people to sort of score their feelings about their lives based in these different categories. So GDP per capita, so this would be looking at economic factors. They ask about social support. Do they feel like they have a network of support, whether that be social, friendships, community resources, national maybe safety net programs that can help them. They look at life expectancy, or like longevity, basically, and how long and healthy people live. Freedom, generosity. Do they feel like they live in a generous, giving society? And then finally, they look at perceptions of corruption, like how much can they trust their officials and leaders. And so they take those and they try to come up with a score of 1 to 10 on these different categories. And they compile these and then rank them and compare them from country to country. And so all of these different tools are used to try to help governments and intergovernmental organizations try to determine the trends as far as what people feel about inequality in the world. So on the screen you see a map that might be a bit surprising. This is actually from the 2022 World Inequality Report. And this map shows countries where there is high inequality versus moderate inequality and then low inequality. So in the red countries, you see levels of high inequality. And in the blue, you see the most extreme cases of low inequality. I'm sorry, the red is high inequality, the blue is low inequality. So blue is good, red is bad in this graphic. And so according to the United Nations, currently there about 71% of the world's population lives in countries where inequality is growing, where people are there's a greater gap year after year. There's a larger gap between the poorest members of society and the richest members of society. So that's happening in most countries around the globe. What's surprising about this map and these results from 2022 is that you have a collection of countries that you might expect to have high levels of inequality. You can see sub-Saharan Africa, the lower portion of Africa, several nations there. You see Latin America. But then you also see the United States on this list. And I think that many people might be shocked to see the United States. But again, this isn't a measure of poverty or absolute poverty. This is a measure of inequality. And so what we see in the United States is that there's a very large portion of society that lives at or below the poverty line. And then we have also on the upper end, in the top 5%, top 1%, we have some of the richest people in the world. And so, in fact, I think in the U.S., the statistics kind of fluctuate a bit each year, but something like the top 5% of Americans make more than the bottom 50% of Americans in total, right? So you have a very small percentage of people at the upper end of the wealth spectrum who are making more than the majority of people. They're making more combined than the majority of individuals in the U.S. So, and remember, America's a big country, right? So we're talking about, literally a couple 100 million people who collectively are making less than the thousands of people who are at the very, very top of the wealth scale. So that's why there's a high level of inequality in America, even though there's not necessarily a high level of absolute or extreme poverty in America. So for a course like this, it's of course helpful and important to recognize inequality within a country, but it's also important to be able to analyze and compare and contrast inequality across countries from one nation to another. So global economic inequality can be analyzed using the three frameworks you see on your screen. We can look at inequality within an individual country. That's like the previous slide I was just talking about, the inequality that exists in the United States. So you can look at it on that national level within a country. The second framework is to look at inequality across nations. So comparing one country to another and seeing how they match up. And then finally, to look at disparities between the rich and the impoverished globally. So looking at the upper echelons of the wealthy globally versus the low end, the most impoverished people globally. So that means we're collectively looking at how the poor fare against the ultra rich around the globe. So, a few different ways that we can look at it and analyze the impact of inequality around the world. The three trends that we see with inequality around the world is one, inequality within most countries is increasing. That means if you pick up any one individual nation, you look at the metrics for inequality within that nation, most likely the gap between the rich and the poor is increasing. At the same time, you can look at the gap that exists between two different countries, and most of the time we see that's shrinking. So it means that the across countries or from one country to another, there's actually a smaller gap. That means most countries, and this is a good thing. This is a good thing. It means that most countries are experiencing at least some level of economic growth that is helping to close the gap between the richest nations and the poorest nations. So between inequality between nations is shrinking. But then if you look at inequality among individuals worldwide, you see a really dramatic rise in the gap that exists between individuals. That means looking at the poorest of the poor globally versus the richest of the rich globally. So we have we have some incredibly wealthy individuals globally here in the U.S., but around the world. And then, of course, we still have massive levels of individual poverty around the world as well. So this, of course, could lead to problems that we'll look at here in just a few minutes. So as mentioned in the previous slide, when we look at inequality from nation to nation, we actually see a shrinking of that, and that is through economic growth. The problem with that economic growth is we can't get too excited when the growth we see is disproportionately benefiting the ultra rich. So since 1980, the top 1% have gained at a 2-to-1 ratio compared to the bottom 50%. So if you think about that, that means at the top end of that spectrum, we're seeing massive inflation that's twice the rate. Inflation, sorry, I shouldn't mix my economic terms. Inflation here is not a bad thing necessarily. What I mean to say is that they've seen twice the rate of growth in their incomes as the bottom 50%. So the richest 10% earned 52% of global income in 2022. The poorest 50% made only 8% of global income. The top 1% share of global income increased from 16% in 1980 to 20% in 2020. That's 1%, the top 1% of global income. So that's very small percentage. Very small number of people that are now making up about 20% of global income in total. It's not hard to see why inequality within your own country is important. If you're from the United States, you might be very frustrated by news of the ultra rich getting richer and richer each year, and those of us who are working class or the poor continuing to struggle year after year with stagnant wages and inflation and so on. So inequality within our country, whichever country you might be from, is obviously important to us. But I also think that inequality globally is important for us to take a look at. And I mean that inequality not just between nations, which we've seen is actually decreasing to some extent, which is a good thing, but I'm talking about inequality among individuals globally. And so I'm going to give you a few reasons now why I think it's important for us to have inequality on our radar and to think about it seriously and to look for ways to decrease inequality and to make the world a more fair, equal place. So why should we care about inequality? The first reason is just there's an ethical imperative towards human rights. We believe that a world with extreme poverty and disparities in access to basic necessities is just morally unjust. Um, it's crazy to think about the amount of wealth that exists at the very top of that spectrum. And then to think that there are people in the world who just can't even get access to clean water or basic health care. And a world where those two polar extremes exist, I think is less stable and inhumane in a lot of ways. We can look at some of the consequences of this kind of imbalance, this kind of inequality. There have been famines throughout history that were, uh, you know, due to, in large part, inequality within societies where resources were hoarded and kept by the ultra rich, not shared, and the result was a lot of human suffering and death. So we have a world where we've got a large number of needs and a large number of preventable diseases and people who are hungry. And at the other end of that spectrum, we see hordes of wealth that really could be used to try to solve some of these problems. And I just think that that's inhumane. It's just, I don't have all the answers for it. I'm not suggesting that I know exactly how we should go about ending this kind of disparity, but I just think that if you look at it at face value, you have to come to some conclusion that something just isn't quite right. To have one person who is um, overwhelmed with all of their wealth, and on the other end we have people that are starving. Another reason that we should care about inequality is because it does pose a threat to global stability and security. So, with large portions of the population excluded from the economic opportunities and political power that most of us have access to, this breeds resentment, social unrest, and extremism. So, many of the historical revolutions that we've seen, the uprisings around the globe, have been due to the strong sense of inequality that exists within different societies. And so for greater stability, it's good for a society to work towards a goal of greater equality. Societies where there's a great sense of equality, where people feel like they have uh, similar access, and opportunity with their peers, with their neighbors. Those are stable societies. Those are societies that don't go to war, that don't have a lot of civil unrest, and so on. So where we see the inequality globally, we also see a rise in extreme views. So having very impoverished nations, when they look at wealthy nations, oftentimes that creates extreme ideas that can lead to things like terrorism and just instability regionally. And so I do think that a pursuit of greater equality will lead to a safer society and a safer world. Another reason we should care about inequality is just because it makes large scale challenges more difficult to combat. So we want to live in a world where problems are solved, where when we face crisis, whether it be economic crisis or health crisis or an environmental crisis, that we're able to spring into action and solve those problems to try to help people, to make life better for a vast majority of the people. And whenever you have great inequality in society, that's really hard to do. If you have a huge population of poor people who have no money, have no resources, that means governments don't have as much tax revenue. It means that it's more difficult to find those resources because they're all kind of accumulated at the very top end of the wealth spectrum. So it's just a big challenge, and greater equality leads to better problem solving. We can fix more of society's issues, and we can prepare ourselves to deal with some of the different variety of crises that we might face going forward in a more equal society. Another reason we should care about inequality is that it actually does slow economic growth. Think about when you have a large middle class, you have a large group of people within a society who are able to purchase basic goods, they're able to buy groceries, they're able to buy maybe cars or at least some type of transportation, they're able to pay for health care and so on. This has been really one of the reasons that the US economy has been so strong, is because for a very long time we had a very strong middle class, a consumer base. And when you have a world that is less equal, when you have a world that has a great deal of inequality, then your consumer base is smaller. And while you might have some at the top who are accumulating wealth and hoarding it, the wealth within a nation is limited whenever you don't have a strong middle class and consumer base. So inequality definitely slows economic growth. And if we want a global economy that works well, we want people to have more equality. The final reason I'll give for why you should care about inequality is because it's your future we're talking about. It's your kids' future we're talking about. If you want a world where your hard work feels like it's rewarded, if you want a world where you can travel freely and you're not worried about global threats, global risks, you're not worried about maybe paying your medical bills, right? Then you want a world that's more equal. You want a society where the wealth and the economic output is shared amongst the people rather than hoarded at the top. You want a world where the majority of people are satisfied with their lives, who feel like they can afford to live a relatively comfortable, prosperous, thriving life. And so a pursuit of equality grows an economy, makes a healthy society, and that's the future that you want. That's the future you want for yourself. That's the future that someday when you have children, you'll want for your kids. So we should pursue equality, not just in our own countries, but globally, because it makes for a happier, more prosperous future. And I think that's something we can all agree on.